In this screencast, I'll present a minimal implementation of the first phase of our project. It will employ a bean for sending and receiving basic email. Let's begin by looking at the beans. Here on the left, we can see the JAGStarter 01 project, already up on GitLab for you to access. The program is divided into packages that define the different actions or data required. We see the first one, com.kenfogel.mailAction. This is the basic send and receive, which contains the code for sending and receiving email. Next is the mail bean package. This package contains the bean that contains or that represents the messages that we send and receive. Finally, the mail config bean. Here's where we keep information about the mail server so that we can connect and send email. We see the resources folder. This contains the log4j2 XML, which configures the logger. And then in the test packages, we first see the method logger. This is a neat little utility that allows a log message to be written whenever a test begins or ends or fails. And finally, the actual test unit, mail action test, that we'll take a look at, that demonstrates or proves whether or not our mail works. Let's look at the mail config bean first. It contains information that allows us to connect to the server. Because we're using Gmail, there's only 3 fields that we need. The host, which may either be SMTP or IMAP, the user email address, this is also your login name, and your password. The rest of the bean is pretty standard. We have a default constructor, we have a non-default constructor, and then we have the setters and getters for each field. The real heart of our system is going to be a mail bean. This is going to be a class that contains all of the different fields necessary for either sending or receiving emails. Here in this basic sample, I've stripped it down to just a few key fields. You will have to add all the missing ones. The first is the to field, and because it's possible to send an email to more than one person, it's represented by an array list of type string. I have the sender, or who the email message is coming from, and this would be coming from your mail config bean. We have the subject line, and finally the text message. I have 2 other fields that are not being used in this sample, just to remind you of additional information that has to be here. For instance, the folder name, and finally the mail status. Is this a message that we sent, or is this a message that we received? For the most part, the rest of the bean is fairly straightforward. We have a default constructor, we have a non-default constructor, and then we have the matching setters and getters, get from, set from, get subject, set subject, and everything seems pretty much to pattern until we get to the very end of this bean where we get to the array list for the to. Because if you look, you'll notice that there is no set to field. There is only a get to field. Get to field returns a reference to the array list. With that reference in place, we are able to both read and write. We do not want a set to field because this would allow us to replace the array list. We never want to replace it, we just want to add new fields or new email addresses to it for when we're sending an email. Here we are in the basic send and receive class. This is where the actions of the program take place. There are just two methods here. The first is send email. It receives in its parameter list a mail bean. This is the message that it's going to send. And it receives a mail config bean, so it's able to interact with the SMTP server. The return value is the string of the message ID that is returned by the SMTP server if the message is sent successfully. Next, we create our SMTP server. Notice again it's SSL, so we include from the config bean the user address and password. In the first JOT example, we saw something called the fluid interface. In this example, the interface to the email class is more traditional. First, we begin by creating the object, and here we're using the factory pattern, whereby the object is created from a static method rather than the new. Then, individually, we set the from field, coming from the config bean. The to field, well, the potential there is that there's more than one to, so here we have to process the array list in the mail bean, and using the email.to, we are adding every email address this is to be sent to. The subject field is next, the text message, we create our session, we open our session, we send the email, and here's where we get the message ID, we close it up, and then return that message ID. Receiving email requires only a single parameter, in this case our mail config bean, so we can connect to the IMAP server. The return, though, is the mail messages. And because there could be more than one message waiting for us on the server, we receive it as an array list. We configure the IMAP server. We're not doing any debugging, so we're directly implementing an IMAP SSL server. Create our session, open it, and now this one command, receive email and mark seen, retrieves all the messages from the server. Now, for the sake of our testing, we are assuming that you send one and receive one. But our code, of course, can handle the possibility that there's more than one message. Assuming that there are messages, that the array is not null, we can now create our array list of messages and proceed to process the messages one at a time. We create a brand new mail bean and then fill it with the from field, the subject field. Again, because there could be more than one to, we process it through the array list of possible choices, and then we pick up the text of the message. Mail messages can be multi-part, and so we retrieve all of the parts. But in this example, we're only interested in the first part, which is normally the plain text. And then we add this new message to our array list. Remember that in your code, both for sending and receiving, you're also going to have to handle the to field, the from field, the attachments, and you should also be storing the dates to and from, or sent and received. Here is the unit test for our system, the mail action test. It consists of a reference to a rule called the method logger. This allows the system to produce a log message when a test is run, when it ends, or when it fails. There's a reference to our logger so that we can send messages out to it. And then the actual test is carried out by something called test send email. Because we need to both send and receive in the same test, we have a config bean for sending, a config bean for receiving, and the actual object that we're testing, the basic send and receive. We begin by creating a mail bean and filling it with the critical information, such as where it's going to through get to field, set from field, set subject, set text, and then off the message goes. Here we receive the message ID. Here's the 5-second delay. This is necessary because in some situations, if you try and retrieve the email immediately after sending it, it's not ready for receiving, and so the test will actually fail. This gives Gmail enough time to receive the email and get it ready for you. Now we call upon the receive email, pass it the necessary config, and it returns the array list of possible messages. Remember that for your test to be successful, you should only be sending and receiving a single message. I have a little optional block of log lines that allow me to actually see what the text is in the fields that I'm interested in. The heart of the test happens here, where I compare the strings found in each of the fields to determine if I am retrieving or receiving the same information. Also note the presence of trim. Occasionally, the mail system may add either spaces at the end or even possibly spaces at the beginning of a string. Trim removes any of these unnecessary spaces. There's my assert message, and I hope it works. Here's a quick point about the pom.xml file. You'll notice that I've commented out the standard default goal and replaced it with a goal that ends at test. There's nothing to run, there's nothing to exec, and it's too early in the process to package. So by doing clean, compile, and test, I can immediately determine if my code works, and I don't need any additional code to fool the system into thinking there's a program ready to run. Now let's run our program so that the tests execute and we can see if the program works successfully. At the project, right mouse click, go Run As, Maven Build, and then Run. I'm going to expand the console display and we can watch the messages coming from the system. The tests run. Don't forget there's going to be a 5-second delay after we send the messages. And there we go. There's our results. The test ran successfully. Here's my GitLab page for the project JAGStarter 01. You can see the HTTPS so that you can go off and retrieve the sample code. Don't forget that you'll need to use your own email address because by the time you download the code, the passwords for my email accounts will no longer be valid. Good luck, and as always, if you have any questions, let me know as soon as possible.